more time, one more time. One more time, one more time. How's everybody doing? John was great. You holding it together? We can go a few more minutes more? Okay. All right, good deal. So we are going to go from the inspirational conversation that John started with us to a conversation with folks who are involved in this work every day. I want to frame this conversation very specifically because I have so many friends in this audience, and I was one of those folks who was in the conference room at Sky Song 10 years ago. And I know that we have oftentimes had these conversations about how the power of education has the potential to help create the kind of America that we want and believe that, frankly, we ought to have. And I am both inspired by the fact that everyone shows up every year and does that work every day, and for those of you who know me, frustrated by the fact that the conversation doesn't change as much as it should from year to year. So what I want us to do is to go from the conversation of the aspirational vision into the conversation about what is it that we have to do. And I want to present that through the lens of the great people that we have here on stage. Some of them you'll know, some of them you won't know. John King, the now CEO and president of Ed Trust. Connie Yao, the founder and CEO of LR&G. Topeka Sam, the president and the founder and executive director of Ladies Hope Ministries. And Rima Bragava, my fellow administration person, who is now the CEO of Anthem US. John described a vision that said that we need to not only change what happens in schools, but what happens out of schools. That we need to change what happens not only for young people for whom many things go right, but for folks for things don't work out as they should. So I want to make sure that we touch on each of the pieces of that, and I'm going to let these folks talk to you about the perspective that they bring, not only like what role they're in, but the perspective they bring to this conversation, but also to talk to you about a little snippet of the part of the world they think needs to change in order to realize the vision that John described. John, I want to start with you.
Sure. It's great to be here. It's great to have this opportunity to talk with you all. I think where I would start is I come to this work from the perspective, like John, of having been a kid whose life was saved by public schools. Lost both my parents as a kid, my mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And it was New York City public schools that saved my life and made it possible for me to do everything else I've done in my life. I became a teacher and a principal because of what those New York City, that's right, because of what those New York City school teachers did for me. But what I worry about is that for all the work of education reform in which so many of us have been involved, all the folks in this room, we have not gotten enough done. We're moving too slowly. The gaps are too wide, right? There's a lot more that we need to do. When you look at the achievement gap, 20, 30, 40-point achievement gap between kids of color and white students. When you look at who's getting into college, who's graduating from college, yeah, we're sending more students on to college, which is a good thing, but not enough African-American students are graduating, not enough Latino students, not enough low-income students, first-generation students. So we have so much more to do, and we have to acknowledge in rooms like this that innovation hasn't yet delivered in too many places. In fact, some of the innovations in which we all have been involved aren't addressing the very equity issues that got us started in this work, right? And I worry, you know, we think about the power of technology to support learning. Too often, kids are doing activities. When I visit classrooms, I know you have this experience, Jim, you walk in a classroom and people say, oh, look at all the great technology. And then what kids are doing is a worksheet on a screen, right? It's not actually transforming learning. We know that virtual charters have been a disaster for kids all over the country. We know that in too many places, certificate programs promise a path into the workforce, but in reality, the default rates look exactly the same as they do for folks who've dropped out of college. We haven't done enough in rooms like this all over the country to say the starting place for innovation has to be how will it drive equity, how will it drive better outcomes for low-income students and students of color.
So I come to the work at this moment, which is a moment in the country where we are increasingly divided and defensive, where we're seeing violence and hate and bias bubbling up around the country, from Silicon Valley to Wall Street to our schools. And in our schools, that manifests itself in everything from extraordinary trauma to the ways in which kids are being bullied and harassed and don't feel like they are welcome and safe in schools. I also come to this at a time where we know that there's incredible income inequality, and I know there's been a lot of conversations today about artificial intelligence and many other forces that will widen that inequality. And at that moment, as we know, these are the greatest threats to our stability and our ability to sustain innovation and change and all the kind of work that we're all trying to do. I also come to this work as another graduate of the Chicago Public Schools in the South Side of Chicago, who was born and raised and now lives there, but who also had a chance as a young college grad to go work with Deborah Quazzo and Michael Moe, and understood that for a young student who wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, they told me there's a way and a place for that in the world of business and innovation. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to figure out how we design this all differently, and how do we design it so that the pathways that we're creating for children are ones where they can develop all of their human potential, and to do that understanding the kind of adversity that they get from the outside, but also the ways in which adversity is affecting what's happening within. And that even as someone who's been a civil rights lawyer who came really close to looking at, and a civil rights lawyer in the Justice Department, and before that at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where for years we have looked at the impacts of deep segregation, the broken democracy that we see ourselves in now, but also what happens with the school-to-prison pipeline, school policing, and the ways in which we are now segregating students not only by race, but by disability and by gender and by LGBTQ status, and the kind of harms that instills in children. And so from all of those perspectives, I'm trying to figure out how we build this out differently now, not as a lawyer and from a liability frame, but from one of like what it is that we can do to integrate all of this in on the front end so that I don't have a job on the back end.
Thanks. Topeka, before you go, I just want to call out something that I noticed when both Phyllis and Jamie spoke, and now John and then Arima. They all talked about their experiences, and especially when you heard Phyllis and Jamie talk, you heard them say, and I wasn't that special relative to many of the kids who had a very different path. And so this question of like how you build a system that actually does it for everyone, that does it, we know it does it for the kids who are well-resourced, but it does it for exceptions along the way. And how do you make that for everyone? So as we jump into that, Topeka, I want you to talk about the work that you're doing, and in particular, the difficulties of the population that you serve.
For sure. So just to kind of add what everyone else is, how I come to the work. So I come to the work as a woman of color who was a young girl who came in a two-family home in Manorville, Long Island, who were franchise business owners and entrepreneurs, who had an opportunity to go to college and take piano lessons and have a recital at Carnegie Hall, and went to college in Baltimore City to study computer science at Morgan State University, at which point I ended up going from campus into the city and seeing a world that I did not know anything about from where I was raised. And so through my journey and really understanding what was happening, I got caught up. And in getting caught up, I made some decisions that landed me into prison. And when I went to prison, in federal prison, I also was a privileged woman even there. Being privileged in incarceration, understanding that I had access to resources, access to opportunity, and that though it was very difficult and the conditions stripped dignity, specifically dignity for women, that still I had visits every week. I had money and commissary and people who cared and loved me and wanted to make sure that I had access and opportunity to when I came home. And whether it was that I wanted to further my education, whether I wanted to start an organization or a new business, that I could do that. But there were so many women that I had met that could not. And so while I was incarcerated, I really saw what was happening with women specifically. You know, and I'm thinking about even when I had the opportunity, thank you, Deborah, for inviting us to the ladies' lunch yesterday, and think about how women are so disenfranchised or marginalized anyway. But then thinking about women, and then being a woman of color, and then being a woman of color who was formerly incarcerated, and what opportunities do we have when we come out? And the fact that there's these hidden incarcerations that people don't talk about, that there's the post-incarceration barriers, that you have to check a box and find out whether or not you can be hired for a job that you could probably have created on your own. And so thinking about the women that I left behind and understanding that women specifically when I was incarcerated end up having adult continuing education classes like knitting and crocheting, plastic canvassing, and beading. And how did those courses or continuing education classes help to further anyone's skill set in order to come into a workforce? So when you think about the school-to-prison pipeline, you don't want the prison-to-prison pipeline, right? Because then people end up coming back. And so I was fortunate enough to come back and have mentors and resources through friends and organizations and institutions like Columbia University, where I was able to tap into things that helped me to then further what I wanted to do and then pour into other women and girls who were coming home.
Great. Connie.
Thanks, Jim. I want to start just with two comments first. One is that I want to deeply, deeply thank John Legend for coming and joining us and for giving an incredibly inspiring and motivational talk and calling out the moment that we're in for a movement, which I think could not be more important. I also want to thank him for the incredible honor of being able to work with him on LRNG Innovators over the last 3 or 4 years. The second comment I want to make is I just want to note that this is what the equitable panel of the future looks like, and I want to thank you all for letting me join you on this panel, because I just think this is such an important conversation that we're having tonight. The filter that I come from, there are lots of different ways and different stories I can say about which filter that I come with. The one that I want to share with you tonight is that I am in 2000, I started a wonderfully privileged job of being the director of education at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And we were doing very traditional educational grant making. Around 2002, 2003, our then president, Jonathan Fanton, and John Sleep Brown, who's a former head of Xerox PARC, came to me and said, we're going to end all of our grant making in education and in public education, and we want to spend the rest of our time sort of looking around the corner to really understand how technology and digital media may change the way in which learning and education looks like. To which I said, in my brilliance, I said, well, I quit. I have no interest in that. I am here because I care about social justice. That is what my passion is, and technology has nothing to do with that. So brilliance has always been my strong point, as well as foresight into the future. Fortunately, they said, well, why don't you take some time off, continue to do this work half-time, and spend the other half-time doing some other things. I embedded myself for a year in National Writing Project, one of the most amazing teacher professional development communities I think we have in the country, and I spent time meeting amazing innovators. And within a year, I realized, oh my God, we now have the tools in order to create the kinds of pedagogically rich learning experiences that we can scale for all of our kids. That was in 2003, and now I can also say, God damn it, we missed a generation. We didn't do it over the last 10, 15 years. And so the moment that I think John Legend is calling us to is now is the time that we have got to transform the learning experiences that our young people are having at scale for all of our kids. The last thing I'll say is the work that I do at LRNG is to take the incredible work that we saw in that sizzle reel of LRNG innovators. Those teachers are doing heroic things. We do not have an educational system that enables that kind of work to scale to all of our kids, and we actually need a differently designed infrastructure that enables ecosystems to thrive in the communities where they most need to thrive, and that's the work that we're doing with LRNG.
Fantastic. So let's pick up right on that point, because I think what happens oftentimes is we have these kind of lofty conversations and what exactly it needs to look like what exactly it is, the experience the students need to have, what kind of environments they need to be in, what kind of relationships they need to be involved in. It's not clear to people, and so we walk out and everybody walks out thinking they have a really inspiring idea, but they go to do different work when they leave. Before I turn to my specific question, I'm going to just note something else. I was really nervous about tonight. And I was nervous about tonight because it would be very easy for the social justice night to be the black and brown night. And I think it is so important that we all recognize we are in this work together. And I just so appreciate everybody who is here and in the work. So with that, let's talk about what it actually takes to do this work. And Connie, I want you to start because John specifically described a world that was both in school and out of school.
Yeah.
That touched on employers, that touched on community-based assets, and touched on schools. And I know you're involved in creating that connective tissue. So I want you to talk a little bit about the what in terms of the infrastructure that's required, and then I want to come back to everyone chiming in on about, and then what kinds of things we need to put in that infrastructure.
And I'll try to be brief. But I take the vision that John laid out in his keynote deeply seriously, and so have really, with the whole community of folks, been pressing on what is the infrastructure that needs to exist in order to allow all of us to participate in transforming the lives of our young people. And so I want to do it by giving you an example of work that's going on in Chicago right now. That is a pilot, it's just beginning, but I think it really begins to tell the story of how we can all participate together. And as I'm telling this story, there are three things that I think are at core to the what of needs to happen in order for the ecosystem to be built. One is that we need to be able to count learning wherever and whenever it happens. In the story I'm going to tell you, we do that with open badges. The second thing is that we have to have lightweight tools that allow us to connect competency pathways together with strong learning environments wherever those learning environments exist, online, offline, in school, out of school. Third, we have to connect when kids build competency and demonstrate competency, it has to connect to opportunity. We have this massive gap between when kids learn and when an opportunity connects for them, and we've got to shorten that gap. So here's the story. Apple comes into Chicago. Employer, absolutely critical to have employers at the table. And they say what we're all used to folks now saying to us is we want everybody to be able to code. And so we want to come in and help teachers learn how to code, and we have a curriculum called Swift Curriculum. Terrific. Absolutely what Apple does, it's what they should do. Chicago has an incredible summer youth employment program, One Summer Chicago. They say to Apple, awesome, but here's the thing. If we're going to double down on kids learning how to code, they need jobs. Are you going to bring jobs to the table for summer youth employment for these kids to actually use those skills immediately? Apple says, well, we actually don't employ that many folks, but we have a lot of customers. We can bring IBM and Rush Presbyterian Hospital, and we can bring McDonald's all to the table for jobs. Fantastic. But then how do you get, where are the kids going to learn how to code? Right? And part of what we can do is we can badge kids who have that competency wherever they learn it, so when they show up for the job. So we're doing that with One Summer Chicago, we're doing that with Apple. Nonprofit partners across Chicago, particularly in our low-income communities, in Austin and Pilsen and around, raise their hands and say, we can do after-school coding clubs. We want our young people to be able to code. They have the Swift curriculum, they can badge it so it's going to count, and we've got jobs that can be unlocked. But then the local partners say, but wait a minute, it's not just the coding that matters. We want our kids to be able to solve community-based problems. We want them to be able to use technology in a way that advances our community. So we add in with them into this competency-based pathway a whole set of brainstorming and design challenges that says to the kids, what problem in your community do you want to solve? They come up with incredible problems that they want to solve, and then the next challenge to them is, so how would you solve that with a mobile app? The kids then come up with really inspiring ideas about what their mobile app would look like. So we can badge them around civic engagement and community engagement. And now they're on their pathway to build and learn Swift coding because they're going to build the app. Well, the school system says, we don't have the time to actually build this into our curriculum because this is happening now. We can run boot camps during spring break and badge there. We can have showcases to celebrate these kids all across Chicago as they're both becoming community leaders, problem solvers, and learning how to code and getting jobs. Amazing assets in our communities, all making this happen. We didn't create any of that, it was there. The combination of Apple with opportunities is a magnet to bring people together, but an ecosystem of lightweight technology that enables connection creates the ecosystem.
Thanks for that, Connie. I think it's a really powerful example because it shows how to make those connections across. I think that we have all kind of come clean with the notion that this is the kind of ecosystem you need to create to allow many, many kinds of kids to thrive. I think that we also have struggled with the fact that we have failed over time to figure out how you actually scale what all kids need to thrive to be affordable and accessible to all. And so I want to actually come to you to talk about, well, who are the kids that are getting left out and what do we need to do to address those needs? Either John or Anna Rima, please lean in terms of the things you've been thinking about on that front.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
I mean, I think we heard from John earlier a lot about the kids who are being left out of this process. This is not a surprise to anybody, right? So we are at a time where a lot of the innovations that we're talking about at the summit are not ones that talk about students with disabilities, that talk about English learners, which are a significant population in not just on the coast, but in every part of this country. We're not talking about the ways in which children who are experiencing trauma and a whole host of challenges around their developmental potential are getting the kind of supports that they need, and instead are in situations where we basically have 2-year-old metal detectors and 20-year-old books, right? So we're talking about the places where we see much more of a presence of law enforcement and a situation in which, we had cases all over this country where students were being arrested so that they could get counseling as a means to get counseling, or students were being arrested for wearing the wrong color socks. Those are the kinds of places where the educational needs of students are not being privileged over the ways in which they need to be supported and feel safe. And so, I think those are the vulnerable communities that I would lay out. I also just think that the conversations we're having in our broader communities about sexual violence and racial violence, we have to realize the ways in which that is not only includes our youngest children, which is really hard for us to all be able to talk about and acknowledge, but also the ways in which those moments of violence are impacting our children, and the time that we are in is being internalized all over this country, both in terms of the way in which they view their own potential, but the way in which they view their own safety and ability to engage in school and in the community.
Thanks. I want to push John. You had, through both your work as secretary, I don't think either of us mentioned that he's the former Secretary of Education, and in your role at Trust, have the opportunity to see people who are trying to do this work right, who are trying to change their discipline policies, who are trying to address the needs of kids that have trauma. So why don't you take a second to talk about what it looks like in systems where this work is going right, and how we begin to think about scaling that.
Yeah. I think it's a question of having the right incentives and the right policy environment. So the right incentives means how do we incentivize people focusing on closing opportunity gaps for low-income students and students of color? So I think about in higher ed, a place like Georgia State that is using better advising systems to help first-generation students, low-income students, students of color graduate. They have largely closed the racial gaps in their graduation rates at Georgia State through smart use of intrusive advising, which I call nagging. But the idea is, an advisor calls you if you registered for the wrong class, or an advisor calls you if you got a bad grade in the midterm and says, what are you going to do about it? What everyone in this room would do for our own kids, that's what Georgia State is doing institutionally to try and close those gaps. But the incentives in higher ed don't necessarily align with that yet. That's great leadership at Georgia State. The reality is the incentive in higher ed is mostly to enroll as many students as possible. And whether or not they finish is still secondary. We have to change that. Technology. There are places, and Connie gave one example, there are a bunch of examples around the country, places where technology is being used in smart ways to unlock opportunity for kids that otherwise wouldn't be available to them. I think about the work that Project Lead the Way is doing with computer-assisted design, where you've got kids, I always use this example, you got kids where they work in a pair, Connie and I do the design on computer, then we swap designs, go in the shop, she builds my design, I build hers, amazing. But the reality is, in most of the product sector, the incentives are sell to as many people as possible, not get great student outcomes, close achievement gaps for students of color. So the incentives aren't right. The last point I make is that there are policy changes that we know work in small increments that we should take to scale much faster. You know, I so admire what Topeka does and the work that she is leading. In the mid-90s, Congress did a very dumb thing and banned access to Pell Grants for folks who are incarcerated. Just terrible public policy. We know that folks who are incarcerated get educational programs while they are much less likely to return to prison, much more likely to be successful when they return to the community. So in the Obama administration, we put resources into a pilot program, 69 universities that are using Pell Grants to support folks who are incarcerated getting access to college courses. It's a wonderful thing, and it's too small. 69 universities is not enough. We should take that national. We should do it right away, right? So part of the challenge is we have these pockets of excellence and innovation, but we aren't smart about scaling the incentives and the policy environment to get where we need to go.
So I'm going to come back to you on that one because there is an opportunity to start to move some of those things, and people are trying to do it. I want to talk about what that looks like. But Topeka, I want to we've alluded to the work that you do and how you create hope for people who have been incarcerated. Why don't you describe that work and what it looks like when the system breaks down for somebody, but then you help them recover?
Oh, sure. So the work that I do at my organization is called the Ladies of Hope Ministries, and we're based out of New York, and we help women who are transitioning back from prison through education, entrepreneurship, advocacy, and spiritual empowerment. And so we connect women with resources that typically they would not get if they went into the probation office and asked them, hey, I need some help, this is what I need to do. We make sure that they do them. We also provide housing. So we have a safe housing space called Hope House, which makes sure that women have a beautiful and safe place to live, because we do know that the #1 problem with people who are coming home is safe housing. And the #1 thing that anyone needs, right? And the #1 thing that anyone needs is a safe place to live. So what we like to do is make sure that we're able to provide that for women in New York. We're going to expand it within New York City and then across the country where there's a prison or jail, making sure that women have housing first and then access to education, entrepreneurship, and resources through advocacy. Thank you. And I just wanted to touch on one other thing.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. And I wanted to also touch on another thing. Just that the largest workforce development hub of people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and yet it is so underserved. And you know, we need to start thinking about how do we tap into our population, right? Because there are the most brilliant innovators, creators, like myself and my other cohort members that are in the room from the Unlock Futures cohort. I want to give them, right? Who just need the education, the access to the opportunity in order to transform and thrive in their lives. And so I really want us to think about how do we make sure that this is all of our responsibility, and not just those who may have been directly impacted, but those of us who are also impacted because we're all in this country together.
So I want to close us out on this question, right? Because there are two things that I think that I've started to realize after a couple of decades in this work. One is that I think about myself as being in the education business for a long time, and what I've started to say is that I'm actually in the power business. And what I mean by that is that a very specific definition of power is the ability to create, limit, or make choices for oneself or others. And there is nothing that does that like education. The second thing is that, as we've described, our big challenge, though, is about scale, about reach, about how we get it to everyone. And that one of the reasons that we fail to actually create equity is the inability to scale what people need to thrive affordably, and to be able to create the context for that to happen. So I want to I'm going to go back to you, John, because I warned you, but then anybody can go. How do we begin thinking about this work, not in dozens of people, not in hundreds of thousands of people, but in the millions of people we need to touch, and especially those folks that we need to touch most?
Well, look, I think this is an organizing challenge, right? I mean, Phyllis talked about the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. One of the things that was hard being in Memphis a couple weeks ago to mark that horrible anniversary is that Memphis, a lot of the indicators of economic inequality, racial inequality look very similar today to 50 years ago, right? We haven't lived up to the legacy of Dr. King around organizing for a more just society. So what does organizing look like? Well, this is a powerful room of people who could organize, one, in your own community, right? So this question of, John and Anna Rima both brought up the issue of school segregation. That's a choice that communities make. That's a choice communities make about school attendance zones. It's a choice communities make about housing policy. That's made at school board meetings and city council meetings and town council meetings every day. We ought to organize around different decisions. There are state-level policy questions. John brought up the issue of suspension of kids from school, the school-to-prison pipeline. 18% of the kids in pre-K are African-American. 48% of the kids suspended from pre-K are African-American. Pre-K, 4-year-olds, right, who are sent home from school as though that's going to make it better, right? So there are communities around the country and states that have said, no, we're just going to ban suspensions in pre-K. And we're going to say that for 4-year-olds, we can figure out a better way, right? So there's political organizing to move policy. There's community organizing to change policies in the community. And then there is driving with investment a different vision. Does the designer of a new software a new app start with the question, how can I address equity issues for low-income students, students of color, English learners, or students with disabilities? Or do they start with, I'm going to design it for the regular kid, question what regular means, and then afterwards, oh yeah, and what about kids of color? And oh yeah, what about English learners? And oh yeah, what about students with disabilities? No, that's exactly backwards. We should start with an equity vision, right? And what investors choose to invest in, who they choose to invest in, helps to shape that.
I think there's a couple of questions to expand who's in the work and also how we actually make the work more affordable. And so on who's in the work, I think one of the questions for all of us is trying to think differently about not who we're innovating for, but who we're innovating with. And specifically, how do we use all that creativity from those who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated to the children in our schools who are at an unprecedented moment of being able to figure out themselves how they can bring transformation to what's going on in their communities? How do we actually engage more in the work of innovation? And also the very simple thing that we all know in education, which is when we don't address things on the front end, we pay dearly for them on the back end. And so when people talk about affordability, to me, I just don't understand why it is that the kind of costs that we have when we don't address everything from trauma to segregation to people not having educational opportunities on the front end when we're expelling pre-K students rather than actually figuring out how their brains develop and we can support that, we end up paying for it much more so on the back end. And I'm trying to figure out how we actually change the paradigm to not be one where, again, like we're hiring lawyers instead of hiring people who can prevent and treat and counsel on the front end.
So there's a few things. What I consistently heard was everyone talk about children in our K through 12 population. And if we don't address the needs of them, then they become kids who go into baby jails, who become adults who go into prisons. And I think it's very important for us to make sure that we are focusing on these populations that are not that are underserved. Like, that's extremely important. I also think that we also need to look at the population and say the same things that are helping the children, the access to education and opportunity, is the same thing that's going to help people who are incarcerated. And how do we give those resources and opportunities so when people come home, they can thrive? Also, I'm thinking about, again, when I was talking about the knitting and crocheting, right? We don't need a future leaders who can knit and crochet. We need programmers, right? We need people who can code, and we need software developers. And all of these are people who are inside the prisons as well. So I want us to redefine diversity, thinking about what does that look like, that it should include not only those based on race, religion, and gender, but also people who've experienced things differently in their life who also have the ability to build and exceed and be as great as any one of us in this room.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said, and I don't know that I have anything special to add to it. So given that this is an ed tech audience, what I will also add is that at the end of the day, learning is relational and learning is social. And it happens in communities. And we all have to be a part of building those communities. We all have our own skills and assets that we can bring to this conversation and be a part of this moment in this movement. But we can only do that if we come as good listeners and as learners in the participation of figuring out what the solution is. If we come to this with, I know everything about education, or I've had my one conversation with a student or my one conversation with a teacher, we've missed the moment. And so we all have to come to this with our skills and assets, ready to dig deep, understanding it is the moral question of our time, and participate as learners with the kids and with the teachers. And our tools have to enable that.
So we're wrapping here. I just wanted to say one more time, the reason I wanted to come is because when I come here, I know I'm with the people who are some of the most innovative problem solvers that I know. They are in the work. They are doing the work, and they're trying to change lives. But the pace at which we need to move, it only is getting more urgent that we move faster and think bigger. And so I hope this conversation and the frame that John prepared for us helps us land in that place. I'm going to make an audible now because I was supposed to bring John back up here to a couple more questions. But I'm just going to ask him, I think is he back there? Come on, John, can you just come up here?
Yeah.
Great. I'm not going to ask you any more questions tonight, but I want everyone here to be able to thank our panelists and to thank you for the table that you set and the challenge you put before us. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.